Washington. I am the founder and chief brand officer of Duke and Joe Branding Creative Consultancy, and my presentation is Hidden History, Black Americans in Graphic Design. The the purpose of this presentation is to bring awareness to the unsung heroes of advertising and graphic design, to highlight their contributions, talk about their struggles and their triumphs. Um, so with that, we'll just go to the agenda here. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction on myself, my background, and then we'll go into the historical perspective of the topic. We'll review some data and some of the reasons and potential, so the reasons for the lack of representation, but also the reasons why um, this history has not been talked about on a scale that it should have been. And we'll talk about potential solutions and then open it up for discussion at the end. And this is brought to you by Duke and Jill, like I said, which is a branding and creative consultancy. So I am a designer, strategist, creative director, and facilitator. I've been a creative professional for 10 plus years. I lived in New York for 15 years, and I've worked with a variety of brands from Hot 97 to McDonald's, Essence, AT&T, and Taylor Loft. Where I come from originally, Saratoga Springs, New York. And like I said, I lived in Brooklyn for 15 years. Growing up in Saratoga, I had the privilege of going to a high school that was fairly well resourced. So I had access to Mac computers, so Photoshop and Illustrator back in the early days when it was, version 3 or 4, like really early on, Photoshop. And I was able to take part in projects and packaging projects and website projects pretty early on. And at the time, I was still, or I noticed at the time that I was one of maybe 2 Black students in my class, and this is a theme that I would come to see throughout high school and when I got to college. So within that sense, because I grew up in a majority white area, probably 95% white, Saratoga Springs, New York. On one hand, I was kind of like an outsider and an insider, in the sense that when you're kind of growing up, you just don't notice differences, like you in the back of your mind you do, but you don't really you're not consciously aware of it until later in life. So later, when I went to Hartford Art School at the University of Hartford in Connecticut, again, I saw the theme continued of being one of the only Black students, in some instances, the only Black student in my design class. So when we were taught about design history in school, I don't remember ever hearing about Black designers or any designers of color. The designers that we learned about were the masters that a lot of us as designers learn about, and that the world overall knows about in general. So some quick facts about design, the industry of graphic design and advertising. The modern era of graphic design started around the late 1800s and lasted until the end of World War II. Printing became common tech and fueled innovation. Artists and designers explored new styles and techniques, and this trickled down to advertising and branding. And when we take a look at the heroes and masters that we're taught about in school and society, they're all white. And a lot of these designers I've looked up to and have idolized their work, especially like Paul Scheer and Paul Rand. But this has been the face of graphic design for ever since the inception of the graphic design era within the West. And not to take anything away from their mastery, their skill, and their knowledge, but unfortunately, the way that the industry has interacted with Black Americans has not been in a way that they've been allowed us to see ourselves within the field, which is part of the reason why the representation is so low. So where are the Black Americans in design history? So first we have to start within the context of American history, right? Until lions have their historians, tales of the hunt shall always glorify the hunters, African proverb. And when I think about this quote, um, when we think about history in the way that we learned about it growing up, whether we're talking about, general world American history or design history, it's told from a perspective that doesn't a lot of times, most of the times, make space for marginalized or minority groups that are within that history, but are just not highlighted in a way that is equitable. So when we think about design history and the contributions of the African diaspora overall, there is a lineage within art and design, especially when we think about it from the perspective of graphic design in the Western canon. So we're going to start by going back a little bit. When we look about design in the African context, we can look back to Ethiopian Christian manuscripts, right? Which are some of the first Christian writings that predate the King James version of the Bible. And when we also look at astronomy manuscripts from Timbuktu, which was a city that was made up of Black and Arabic scholars, there is a tradition when we look at the works of graphic design. Maybe it wasn't kind of thought of or referred to that obviously back then, but it's within the tradition. And also when we look at painting reliefs in Egypt, this one particularly being of a Nubian princess in an Egyptian tomb. So given that, we can now fast forward to the late 18 and 1900s when we start thinking about the semi-modern graphic design era and some of the works at that time and how that relates to representation, Black representation. Because at that point in time, that's when representation was truly awful and what I like to call the bad stuff. So when we look at representation at that time, it's very much inspired by vaudeville and the minstrelsy era, and it perpetuated negative stereotypes and images and ideas about Black Americans. So this stuff was pervasive within the graphic design field then. It was used across commercial design. So, thinking about Aunt Jemima, the original idea of Aunt Jemima was from like a minstrel show and then made its way into commercial products. So this is what Black Americans in America overall had to look at for representation of Black people. A little bit later, or no, around the same time, a designer and artist named Charles Dawson came to prominence as somebody whose work directly was in contrast to those very negative images. A lot of his work was about elevating the image of Black Americans and showing them an image of themselves that garnered respect and self-love for themselves. So he was one of Chicago's leading Black artists and designers of the 1920s and 30s. He executed advertising illustrations for Black major entrepreneurs. He took part in the Work Progress administration under Roosevelt. And if we look at some of his work, for example, we'll sing a new song, which was a Black musical showcase. A theme throughout his work was depicting, again, African Americans in a light that was respectful and was kind of a precursor to the Black Pride movement later in the 1960s and 70s. Looking back at some of the artwork that he did, like say Murray Superior hairdressing pomade, which throughout the years has become a staple in Black households, but then also the larger American public as well. Certain images that may not necessarily resonate later in history or today, but at the time was a step forward for the representation of Black people in graphic design and culture overall. A lot of his best works were hair and body products that depicted Black people, even though, a little backwards when you think about it today with the light skin and wavy hair, but it gave them, again, a respect for themselves that a lot of times wasn't seen in media. Another really brilliant contribution of Charles Dawson was the ABCs of Great Negroes, which was basically a children's book highlighting a lot of prominent Black Americans of the day. and throughout the world. So significance of his work, Dawson played uh, a role in the cultural and economic rise of African Americans in the 20s. He's a founding member of the Black Artists Collective in Chicago, the Arts and Letters Collective. He developed a visual aesthetic in his packaging design that represented the grace, dignity, and humanity of African Americans. Moving on to somebody that you might not think of as a designer, but is very much woven into the history of graphic design overall and the history of Black designers is W.E.B. DuBois. And as you may know, he was a sociologist, historian, civil rights activist, socialist designer, and creative director. And his contribution was being creative director and designer of the exhibit of American Negroes at the Exposition Universelle in 1900 in Paris. And the exposition was held at the World's Fair in Paris. And within his exposition and his what I call infographics or data graphics, he became a pioneer in data visualization, as you'll see. And he worked with Atlanta University on researching graphics. So his data sets were made basically to highlight the progress of Black Americans from the end of the Civil War through Reconstruction or during Reconstruction. So with these graphics, he wanted to, part of what he did was he highlighted the national employment status of Black Americans, the education statistics. He highlighted the Black American populations across the nation, what the literacy rates in the US were compared to other countries, among many of the other data sets. How I found out about this was when I worked at Essence, and they had a free table at Essence with books and products and all this stuff. And I noticed this book on the table that was about W.E.B. DuBois, and I saw a striking graphic on the cover, which looked like, it could be from the past 20 years. And then I opened it up and saw many more graphics, and again, it highlighted or it looked like a lot of the data sets and data fueled graphics that we'll see today in many systems design examples or case studies. And it just kind of blew me away, the modernity of the graphics. And I have the book around here somewhere, but it really did captivate me. And I thought this was very important because these data sets actually predate Russian constructivism and Italian futurism. So he was kind of ahead of his time when it came to modern art. Obviously, he took inspiration from other data analysts and data set graphic creators, but he took it to the next level with the visual aesthetic that he used. And something that was very important to him was being able to create design that could highlight or fuel anti-racist organizing, which falls in line with a lot of the other work that DuBois did throughout his life. So I can't undersell how important this is, personally for me, but how important it is to the history, to Black history, and also to the history of graphic design. And it's criminal how people don't know about this. To be completely transparent, I didn't know about this until the last couple of years. So this was truly an educational experience for me. So just to underline some of the significance of his work, like I was saying, DuBois understood the role that visual culture could play in anti-racist organizing. The data graphics were made again a decade before the dominant avant-garde European movements of Russian constructivism, Italian futurism. DuBois' graphics were published 20 years before the founding of the Bauhaus. So one could see a scenario in which some of the founders of the Bauhaus viewed or saw DuBois' work either at the show or maybe through print or however they saw it. But his work was highly influential. The unique visual forms made arguments for equality and sophistication of Black Americans living under Jim Crow. And this is kind of the problem of American history, because a lot of the information in these data sets were kind of lost because it didn't flow with the idea that a lot of the Jim Crow politicians and people in the South wanted to paint of Black Americans of that time. So it's all about education. This is going to play a big role into some of the later slides that deal with education and how to change the narrative when it comes to Blacks in graphic design and American culture overall. Emmett McBain, which I like to call him the Don Draper of graphic design of Black designers. He was a graphic designer, art director, ad exec, and teacher. Studied at the American Academy of Art and IIT Institute of Design. Joined Playboy Records after graduating from school. Was Playboy's promotion art director at 22. He brought Vince Colors, the largest Black ad agency in the US at the time, their first $1 million account. And he co-founded W.E.B McBain, which at the time and today is one of the most important Black ad agencies in the history of the industry. And later started the consultancy firm, The Black Eye. So with McBain, he is, he's just as important, if not more than Dubois, in that a lot of the work that he did was to highlight African-American culture and art as we are, and not through the lens of, say, a white ad exec or a white creative director. He helped usher in the evolution of communicating to Black people from our point of view and from our experiences. And he championed something called, he championed Black pride and what I think he liked to call, cultural realism, positive realism. There we go. And some of his contributions, as we can take a look at his ads, when we look at more specifically the What Color is Black campaign and the Black is Beautiful campaign, these were significant in that these coincided with the Black Power movement and the Black upliftment or Black pride movement of the late 60s and early 70s. So he was not shy or bashful in his support for Black progressive, Black progress, or the image of Black people being very proud of who they are, and the rejection of some of the lies, many of the lies that have been told through the years about us. Some of his earlier work you can see in the jazz album covers that he did with Playboy. And when we look back at the Newport cigarette ads, even though this type of thing would be frowned upon today, back then it was looked at as a step forward because a lot of Black people weren't represented in advertisement of cigarettes, even though we use cigarettes as well. And if we were represented in these ads, again, it would be from a white lens. So he would come in and try to depict us as we are in our everyday lives. And I think that was a big step forward in terms of proper image and representation within the ad industry. And the same goes for some of the McDonald's ads. And again, I preface this by saying, compared to today's standards, a lot of these things aren't kind of viewed as progressive today, but for the late 60s, early 70s, it would be striking for Black people to see themselves depicted and represented this way within McDonald's ads. So W.E.B McBain is it is the most important ad agency when it comes to Black people in advertising and in graphic design. So the significance of McBain's work, he championed a positive realism in advertising to African-American consumers. He was one of the most successful Black admin and admin of his era. Revolutionary design leadership and social impact, and his album covers designs defined a generation of jazz cover art. And our next designer is, actually, even before I move on to that, I think Emmett McBain, when I think about his contribution to advertising and Blacks in design overall, it's significant to me because at that time, there weren't a lot of Black ad executives. And the way that he was able to penetrate the industry and the work that he did later with his agency, The Black Eye, he pioneered the role of companies that are able to come in and advise and consult largely white companies about how to properly advertise to Black consumers. Even more specifically at The Black Eye than at W.E.B McBain. And he did a lot of nonprofit work at The Black Eye, which continuously led to him going down a more fine art route. But that's another conversation. But I just wanted to point out why he's of significant importance to me. The next designer is another person that is kind of another, she is another part of myself in terms of my journey as a creative designer, as a creative leader, and that is Sylvia Harris, who unfortunately passed in 2011. And she wasn't that old, but she was a designer, a strategist, creative director, and teacher. Graduated from the Virginia Commonwealth University, got her Master's of Fine Arts in Design at Yale, and dedicated her life's work to removing barriers to ensure accessibility to public information. She formed 212 Associates design consulting firm in 1980 with two partners and worked with many public institutions. Sylvia is one of the earliest practitioners of user-centric design, and she dedicated a lot of her work to public information design, what she liked to call being a citizen designer. So this is, working with museums and cultural institutions, schools. She loved creating great visual design systems. And I don't want to make this sound like a eulogy. It's kind of like sounding like that, but she's important to me because of the user-centric user experience focus in her design. At this point in my career, um, strategy and user experience have very much become the focal point of my work. And as her career progressed, she no longer had a specific interest in just visual design for the sake of aesthetics, but with the purpose of being able to communicate better to the general public. And you'll see that in some of the work that we take a look at. Um, a great quote from Sylvia is, "Design teaches us to not make assumptions." And that's something that I use every day in my career in whatever I'm dealing with, to not make assumptions about anything from a strategic standpoint or from a visual standpoint, and to just know which questions to ask to to uncover what potential solutions might be. So as you can see, she designed the identity for the ACLU. Something that's kind of very close to my heart is the Etna African American history posters. A lot of Black Americans grew up having the Black history calendars in their homes. Their parents would post up so you could know what date it is, but also be educated at the same time about um, important figures in Black history. So that's of a particular importance to me. Looking at her design for the 2000 census, um, this is another very important piece of hers because after the 2000 debacle with Bush v. Gore, and uncovering that a lot of the ballots in Florida were designed in a very confusing manner, Sylvia was commissioned by the Design Institute at the University of Minnesota, and she analyzed the entire voting experience from voter registration to casting ballots to exit polling. And she basically, I'm sorry, that was for voting by design, not for the census. So let me hop over to voting by design. So she did all that to spell out the problem in a very digestible way and to provide solutions to how we can fix the issues of design within the system of voting, so it can make it easier for specifically marginalized communities, but for everybody to vote and for us to not have the mix-ups that we had in 2000. And I think she made a great contribution, but obviously, you know, the system isn't quite working as well as it should, based on the ridiculousness of the past few months. But anyways, when we take a look at the census, um, she wanted to simplify the 2000 census again, so it could involve more marginalized communities and minorities to make it easier for them to go through the census. So when we had data and information of certain areas, they could be more properly tallied, and funds and resources could be moved um, in a more effective way to communities that need it the most. And this way of using research and thinking about the underlying foundation of why you're designing something is what is really important to what I do right now, and I think has become become of larger importance to the design industry overall, what we call systems design, because the amount of data and information that we're bombarded with on a daily basis now, um, it's very important to understand what you're designing for, because if it's just about visual aesthetics, you'll be shooting in the dark and you won't have the impact that is needed to actually bring about a solution that helps, whether it's organization, business, or whoever you're working for. Moving on to the Citibank ATM design. From what I understand, this is actually one of the first um, user user experience user experience design projects for an ATM that have been done, and I think that's very important because this is also a precursor to a lot of the UX design that we see done today, and in its kind of infancy form. Back when Sylvia helped design the interaction design for the Citibank ATM, and then also the environmental study and mapping that she did for NYU, which is another example of systems thinking. You know, how does each point of the NYU campus and mapping relate to each other? You know, when you come to signage and mapping, and how do you make the experience of going around NYU simpler for people? And the significance of Sylvia's work. She's an early practitioner, like I said, of strategic design in the UX process. She's a pioneer in social impact design. She co-founded the Public Policy Lab and served as um, the organization's first board chair. And just to kind of highlight a little bit more on Sylvia, I just want to make note of her uh, referring to herself as a citizen designer, and how I feel that type of thinking is what's going to lead the future. We can see it already within going through the coronavirus and the way things are changing within branding and within the advertising industry. You have to be able to think about the end user, the citizen, and you have to put them at the center of your process, because it's too easy for people to be able to find out information about you or your organization and understand places where you don't actually follow through on the promises that you make. So I think that point of Sylvia's work is extremely important. Art Sims, who is another giant in his own right, graphic designer, art director, and teacher. He attended Michigan State. He worked as an art director at Columbia Records while in college. He worked as art director at EMI Records after college, and he is the founder and CEO of 1124 Design Advertising in LA, and connected with Spike Lee and made the iconic movie posters for Do the Right Thing and Malcolm X. And many of the posters that he did were, you know, lined up in um, my own home theater case, and my uncle's home theater bookcases, on the VHS and on the VHS tapes, you know, whether it was Malcolm X or Jungle Fever or Love and Basketball. Um, and actually he pitched Marvel on some key art for the movie that actually didn't get picked, but you know, he was within the Marvel studio, Marvel legacy as well. But it can't be understated how important these movie posters are to Black history and to cinema history. Do the Right Thing is actually in the Smithsonian at the African American Museum of Culture, and yeah, the contribution that he made was huge in the sense that um, these are classic movies within the American canon, when it also within the Black American canon, that are going to live forever. So, significance of his work: he started an independent Black-owned agency. Um, Through his career, Sims has committed to promoting and making visible African American art and culture. So our honorable mentions: we have Dorothy Hayes, Leroy Winbush, Gail Anderson, Thomas Miller, George Olden. A point about Dorothy Hayes: it's a little hard to find information. It was a little hard to find information and work on her, because unfortunately, a lot of what she did, especially being a Black woman in the 1960s and in the advertising industry, a lot of her work she did not receive credit for. And but I still wanted to highlight her as someone who was a Black designer in the kind of heyday of advertising, and I wanted to give her her due. Leroy Winbush was very instrumental to the launch of Jet and Ebony magazines as an art director there. Yale Anderson did a lot of great work with Rolling Stone, and I actually have this book that she designed the cover for, New Vintage Type. And Thomas Miller did some massive uh, redesign campaigns for 7 Up and also the Motorola Identity in 1955. I mean, these are really big brands that had a lot of reach, that a lot of people really didn't know that Black designers have played a role in bringing these brands to life, or helping redefine these brands. Same thing with George Olden. He was a pioneer when it came to being a designer, art director at CBS, and the iconic show graphics that he made in openings, whether it was for the Alfred Hitchcock show, or for I Love Lucy, or for Gunsmoke. Also, he designed the Clio Awards, and he was the first African American to design a postage stamp, and was praised by JFK for the contribution that he made. So again, there's a lot of history here that has been kind of lost throughout the years that is very significant. So Black designers making an impact today. Some of my favorites: Eddie Opara, Adrian Frank, Jessica Bellamy, Raphael Smith, Dana James, and Mwangi. So Eddie Opara is a partner at the prestigious Pentagram design firm, and he did a really interesting rebrand of Cooper Hewitt. And my friend, my boy Adrian Frank, is a artist, and he's an executive art director, I believe, at IBM, and he's worked with Spike Lee, specifically in this example, on a Michael Jackson documentary poster in 2016, which you can check out, I believe, on Amazon Prime. Jessica Bellamy is a systems designer and social impact designer. The same thing with Raphael Smith, who is a, I believe, senior designer at IDEO. And Dana James Mwangi is a designer, lecturer, and she's basically teaches people about the business of design and helps designers find their confidence. So let's take a look at a few statistics. So this part is borrowed from Maurice Cherry's presentation, Where Are the Black Designers? This is based on, some of these numbers are based on AIG and Antoinette Carroll's research. Survey was done for 3 years with basically no change. 3% of designers across all industries are Black within design. And that moved very little from around 1989-90 when it was 1%. And when we look at school statistics, we see that from 2016 to 2020, there's only been a not fractional, but like single-digit percentage move within these schools of representation of Black students. So reasons, well, there are a few. There are educational opportunities, cultural reference points, professional and network opportunities, and discriminatory hiring practices as reasons why representation is so low. So actually, before I even move on, when we think about educational opportunities, a lot of times Black families cannot afford the extremely high price of going to some of the top design schools in the nation, where they were talking about Pratt or RISD. It just kind of closes the door on a lot of potentially great designers to even get their foot in the door, which at the same time presents networking opportunities that feed the school to career pipelines. So looking at cultural reference points, a lot of times where Black students come from, they don't have the cultural reference points of the Bauhaus or the type of artwork that Saul Bass or Paul Rand did. I think it's a little bit better now in the sense of the internet, but culturally, where they come from, that's not something that is highlighted. And also within the design field, culturally relevant work that they may see in their daily lives is not celebrated. which comes back to the point of the reason of even doing this in the first place and highlighting Black designers, is to be able to um, tell their story and have cultural reference points for young and upcoming designers, Black designers. Um, and we'll go into the reasons for the professional and networking opportunities a little bit later and the solutions part. So again, when we look at the school to job pipeline, it's very important within our solutions to be able to build partnerships with high schools, colleges, and community organizations. So whether you're part of a company, whether you're part of a particular organization, or even as as a single person, as a designer that may be able to give of some of your time to a school or organization to help them build their own design programs. To start these programs even as early as middle school, that the earlier you catch kids, the better it is for them in terms of their skill set and their opportunities moving into college and the real world. Um, the early intro into the craft of graphic design is very important to be able to hone and shape skills when it comes to the aesthetics that are pervasive throughout the industry. Those Bauhaus foundations and standards. Mentorship. This is something that anybody can do as well, no matter what organization you work for, or company. Reaching out to high potential Black students or young professionals to coach them on skill development and goal setting. Paid apprenticeships. If you're part of a company or agency, you can start paid apprenticeships to have um, um, Black designers with potential come in and learn about teamwork and communication, presentation, craft, soft skills, and the work on projects. These are all opportunities to be able to change the paradigm and dynamic to be able to get more Black designers and students within the design industry spaces and organizations and schools. Cultural reference points. So going back to what I did earlier in the presentation and making sure to highlight design and artwork from African history. Once a child, specifically a Black child, is able to see themselves within the larger context of art history and what's possible, you begin to let them dream bigger than what they might know and what they see, which is a largely white design and art industry. Teaching history of Black Americans in design, like we're talking about now, providing access to a wider design landscape. And by that, I mean, as somebody that might be a mentor or a teacher that is teaching high school students, revealing to them the artwork of Paul Scher or Paul Rand or Michael Beirut. So it's not just the pen and pixel type stuff, even though that has a place in design history as well. But just making sure that you're giving them variety to look at that then sets themselves up for when they move later and they see that these types of aesthetics are used within school and within in the real world situations. Providing critiques, not holding back and making sure that you let them know what's working and what's not working. That's very important because you don't want a child to come into, or a student to come into the real world and be surprised if their work isn't quite exactly where it needs to be for some type of corporate aesthetic, if that's the direction that they want to go in. And highlighting art movements outside of Western tradition. So on the other end of it, whatever company or organization that you're at, slowly showing colleagues and coworkers that, okay, the Western canon is not the only aesthetic. To be able to properly advertise or reach out to audience of color, Black audiences, these are the traditions within our history. And these are the things that we identify with. So you should not be afraid of adding these things into the different campaigns and the different initiatives that you're trying to reach out to us in. So just looking again at some of the underlying reasons in terms of the economic disparity when it comes to education, and also the fact that HBCUs are generally cheaper than other schools, but they also need some support in developing design curriculums. In my first talk, when I was giving this talk with an ad agency, two former students of, I believe, Howard shared their experience and how they had teachers that were great, but they didn't have the facilities or the equipment to really fully support their design education. So this is an area of development too that further the could help further the development of Black students within HBCUs. So professional opportunities and networking. Reach out to groups like the African American Designers and Who You Know on Facebook, or BlacksWho.design for recruitment. These are groups where you'll find Black designers, and there's actually, there's many more that are out there that you can go to find talent that, they're either, ready to hit the ground running or might need some assistance and mentorship, but we're out there to be found and to provide opportunities for Black designers and creative leaders and providers. So people like myself or others of you that are within the design industry, helping to provide opportunities. If you're in a position of power, in a position of leadership, and you're Black, I think it's incumbent upon you to be able to reach back down and provide opportunities for others that, who you once were and need a leg up in their design journey. Also, white colleagues, reaching out to former Black colleagues and friends intentionally with the explicit idea of trying to help make the design industry more equitable and to bring more Black voices into the conversation. Also hosting mixers once the Rona is over, like in-person mixers. If you're somebody in power at an organization that can bring some of these type of mixers together, just to have conversations with people to talk about, design or career or whatever, just get the conversation going. Host talks, virtual talks about breaking into corporate design, like, just something like we're doing here or on Teams or whatever, Google Hangouts, whatever you use. Just being able to bring a community together specifically around helping Black students or Black designers, providing them with information about how to break into corporate design or what they need to do to be able to further their career in design. So these are some organizations that are making a difference. Creative Reaction Lab, One Club, One School, the Youth Design Center, and AIGA. So Creative Reaction Lab is a organization in St. Louis, Missouri, I believe, that is headed up by Antoinette Carroll, that I highlighted a little bit earlier in the talk. And Antoinette Carroll was motivated by what happened in Ferguson, and she created this organization to be able to help youth, Black and brown youth of color, basically design systems to help redesign systems within their neighborhoods to make them healthier and better places. When we look at the Youth Design Center, I believe it started out as Made in Brownsville, which they've created a youth-led agency where they can go in and take on apprenticeships and mentorships to be able to get real-world experience and build their portfolios. And AIGA has a bunch of diversity and equity initiatives that you can take a look at on their website. And One Club, One School is based in New York and teaches kids the skills to be able to more authentically present themselves within the design industry, whether that's within the context of the non-traditional, non-Western canon of design, and just building up their overall skills to be able to present themselves in their portfolio outside of, or once again, into the professional field. And thank you. That is my presentation. And I'm a little over on my presentation time, but I do want to take at least 5 to 10 minutes to ask you guys to come on and share any comments or questions that you might have about the presentation.
Yes, I find your presentation very informative. I like it because for me it's really a very new topic. And I'm very impressive about that from Dubois, that he was working 20 years before the Bauhaus, which is a huge movement in art, in design. And will be nice also to learn more about ladies in design. I can imagine, of course, there was behind, but Sylvia Harris did a beautiful job. I mean, very impressive. And so thank you very much for your time, for teach us. I mean, for me, it's very informative, and I love the opportunities that you visualize your presentation.
Thank you, Hanya.
I want to congratulate you. It was beautiful. So
thank you, Hanya. I appreciate
I
it.
was expecting now. So that's very nice, very nice.
Thank
So
you.
another person had the word.
I want to say thank you so much. And I know can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, I know earlier on I wasn't able to get in with system preferences. I had to jump on and fix it. So it's great to see you, Cliff. And I've been in the industry since 1985, and it's just wonderful to see this. Just because I just have witnessed the vacuum out there, and it's not that there's a lack of people, because I was an instructor for about 12 years. So I know that I have educated students, and very worthy students. So it's sad to see the lack of them in the actual industry. So it was good to hear those statistics that you provided, and to see, what has influenced that. And I'd like to see some, more measures taken to, bring, have those students have opportunities, because they are blocked out in so many ways. Even the ones that do achieve their degrees and produce valuable and competent portfolios, they are still blocked out in circumstances where there's discrimination and just a lack of opportunity. So that has a very great significance. And I love the history. I'm a history buff, so I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And thank you for joining, Keely. It's been forever since I saw you, and it's good to see you, even if it's over Zoom. But I like hearing about your experience from the 80s, because I don't know if you have heard of Cheryl Miller. She was a graphic designer in the 80s, and one of the few Black women graphic designers in the 80s. She was actually half Black, half Filipino, and she did a really important article in Print Magazine. I can share it in the chat. I forget the exact title of it, but she was making the point that some of the points that I've been making today, and it was even more challenging back then, was that a lot of times Black designers were systematically left out, like you were saying, even though they were qualified, because especially from, like, say, art director positions, a lot of the establishment figures in these companies didn't think that we would have the mental capacity to be able to work in these positions of power, which is a sad thing to say, but it was very pervasive. One of the stories that I remember researching this was from Thomas Miller, who did the redesign for 7-Up and the Motorola design. A New York or Jersey ad agency wanted him to come work for them on the condition that he work behind the screen, so he wouldn't offend other designers and clients. And this was in, I believe, it was either the late 60s or 70s. I can't remember. But that story just stopped me in my tracks.
I have a story. My very first job going in, the woman just said, I was interviewing for a technical illustration job, and I'm really very much an illustrator as well. That's my strength. And I knew I was top, pick for the job. And literally she told the person that was interviewing me that she just didn't think I would fit. I wouldn't be the right fit socially. And he knew exactly what she was saying. And he counted her and he says, no, that's, this is my candidate. This is who I want. And I know what you're doing. I know what you're saying. And it's wrong. So he actually, and that was rare in those days. And that was my first job opportunity. And I nearly did not get. So his background, he was from Thailand. So it's kind of interesting that they were still perpetuating it, even to, all cultures, they were perpetuating this myth.
Wow. So. Thank you for sharing that, Keely. So I wonder if
I'd like to jump in. Oh, that was crazy. Okay. Cliff, I wasn't able to catch the beginning of it, but I definitely caught towards the end. And we've had this conversation. It's been an ongoing dialogue between us. For me in particular, this is really important because I think had I been exposed to the opportunity as design as a career, I probably would have ended up as an industrial designer. Like in my family, um, I had I showcased a lot of very early creative skills in illustration, um, and particularly around design. Like I was fascinated with automobile design. I was fascinated with um, aeroplane design, and in our family, my mother was like, "There's no ability for you to have a career in design or in any kind of creative arts. You had to be a doctor, lawyer, engineer. This is the only way for you to make a sustainable living for yourself." And so it was my family that said, like, no, you're not allowed to enter into this space. I've since made my own waves in this space, and I've still been able to leverage my creativity, Joe, though I'm more of a director role. I haven't been able to, I don't have the technical ability to get down and dirty like I'd like to. But what is really interesting to me is that a lot of the notable figures in the space still um, sort of forget about, and willfully or not, the lack of our presence in the space. It's not that we're not qualified. It's not that we don't have the skills. It's just that for people that are in power, particularly those that are of color, they don't really make the space for us. You know, I had to force my way into the space, and I forced my way into the space through my own agency. You know, I made sure that everyone that I hired brought a really unique cultural diversity to the team, right? And I made sure that my clients knew that our skill and our opportunity, the reason that we were so valuable, the reason that we were so effective in the work that we were doing was because of our cultural diversity, because we're bringing a very global perspective. And that was a selling point, right? But I think, the challenges for the leaders in our space, when are they going to understand that it's a power, it's a value add, to have, our representation, the Pan-African diaspora represented in the design community. Because if you look anywhere else, it's our culture that is being commoditized everywhere else, right? You can't look at a commercial and not hear any AA. You can't look at a commercial and not see the influence of our fashion. You can't look at American culture and not see that it's really founded in African American culture. So how is it that we are continually held out of the spaces that where we prove that our culture is valuable, that our perspective is significant, and that our impact drives revenue? That's the challenge, man.
Thank you, Keone. That
Yeah.
was super powerful. Want to touch on 2 points that you said. One, the family dynamic, and I think that's the last wedge in the last slice in the pizza that'll complete the whole thing. Um, that's tough because I was fortunate in the sense that my parents were pretty supportive in whatever artistic endeavor because we came from a pretty artistic family. So that wasn't an issue. But then, and, again, we've had this conversation before. When I got to college and started hanging around more Caribbean American students, then I started hearing that conversation about, the more practical roots, you know what I mean? Or yeah, the more practical roots of your career and your journey. And then once I got to New York, I also heard that too, even though I was part of a larger creative Black community. And looking back on my history and my journey, asking questions about the people that I grew up with and the paths that they took, and what they were kind of allowed culturally and within their family to pursue, and how they were encouraged or not. Like my friend Adrian Frank, he was fortunate that he had teachers that were very encouraging with his career path in design. But from his family perspective, being from a Black family down south, it just wasn't there, that type of support. So, I think there also has to be a initiative to, I don't know if explain or to teach that, there are careers and you can find stability within professional design careers, that you're not going to starve, you can flourish professionally and personally by pursuing a design career. And then number two, you made the point about opportunity. So originally I was under the impression that before I started doing this research that, maybe there's just not enough of us out there, like maybe whether it's the family thing or whether it's the opportunity or the resource thing about, having the ability to be within design. And then the more research that I did and the characters that I found out about in this story, were littered throughout history, and but we're just not represented within the percentage of us practicing it professionally. And I think it made me think deeper about those reasons why. And then, when you talk about the opportunity thing, it goes back to partially Keely and I were talking about, with a lot of people with power, even sometimes minorities, not thinking that this Black person is qualified, or they don't have the ability to be able to lead a team or lead a campaign or be the senior graphic designer on the team. So realizing that and finding that out, it just kind of changed my whole perspective on it. Now, I still want to be in a position where I can encourage younger designers to pursue a particular path in design, or to provide guidance when it comes to learning about the craft and building up skills in certain software or whatever. But realizing that, 3% might not actually be reflective of the real number of qualified Black candidates out there. I think that's one of the sticking points. I don't know what the real number is, and there's still probably a lot of work to do with whatever the real number is, but learning about these different mindsets and how that's changed my view of it has been one of the most important things of this whole process for me.
No, look, to respond, like, I think you're absolutely right. It's so I'm reminded, I came across an article earlier this week about an early Ford vehicle designer. And he talks about how he got into the industry. And I can't remember the name. I'll need to find the article. But this gentleman, he was the original designer and the original concept designer for the Ford Bronco, which really put Ford on the map in the SUV market. And he talks about the only reason, not the only reason, one of the primary reasons that he was able to have a sustainable career was that he had sponsors. There were individuals of power in the upper hierarchy that really respected his work and made sure that he was given opportunities, that made sure that he was allowed to collaborate on teams, and really carved a path for him so that he could find a space for his art to be taken seriously, for teams to respect him in collaboration, and for the impact of his work to really shine. And I think about that constantly. I work a lot in the future of work in teams and what the future of innovation in teams looks like. And one of the most interesting things that I learned is in entrepreneurship, which is when you have an innovative idea or you're leading change within these large organizations, one of the fundamental ingredients for you to be able to create change is for you to have a sponsor, for you to have some C-level executive that says, I know what you're trying to do, I see that vision, and I'm going to protect you against all of the bureaucracy. I'm going to protect you against all of the infighting, and I'm going to really push this initiative. So either you as an individual or this idea or this concept becomes something that is a core company value and becomes a ritual that we practice, right? I think that's going to be essential for a lot of these organizations, particularly in the design space. Like, I don't consider myself a designer, even though I've had, creative and art direction, experience, I really consider myself more on the strategy side of things. But being on that side, I'm able to see how these little fiefdoms in design really play out, and it's a lot of bureaucracy, and it's the infighting and the culture. Like, you have to have someone that can break that culture and say, this is the process, this is how it's going to operate. This particular person or this initiative or this idea is essential. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. I think we really need to find those allies to push forth this. Um, but that, and continue to build our own organizations. Cliff, you're a shining example of that. Stepping out of that system, and breaking out and carving your own role. And then I think to end the point is the collaborative effect amongst ourselves, right? Like, I truly believe that we're entering into a period where microeconomies are really going to be the future of a lot of the creative work. And our culture is still going to be in demand. So as creatives, how do we protect our cultural creative? How do we align and collaborate with each other, and then partner, so that we can be taken seriously by these corporate overlords?
Mhm. And that's why the example of W.E.B McBain and Sylvia Harris are so important, because knowing that there's a history of this, even though it may not be on the scale that we need it to be on, but thinking about its very early stages back then, how they laid the groundwork for how we need to operate in the mindset of, like, okay, we have the cultural capital. This is something that Tom Burrell said. You need to come to us because we have the cultural capital to be able to market to us. And I don't even want to put it in necessarily marketing terms, but impact terms. We have the ability to impact the community. And if you want to be able to, sell is not the right word. If you want to be able to interact with the community, you need to understand the community, and you need to partner with the community. So it's not just a leeching situation. So again, while some of the examples of the McDonald's ads and the Marlboro or cigarette ads are a little bit clumsy, it was the embryonic phase of what we're doing today. That's why I try to put a finer point on the history and the education, because there's so many kids out in either Brownsville or East New York or maybe Oakland, right, where they're not seeing the possibilities of what it means to be a Black designer, a Black marketer, or a Black social impact person. I think it's getting better, but the more examples out there, I think the easier it's going to become for you and for myself and others that within that same vein to be able to build what we're trying to build. Because hopefully it gets to the point where you're meeting up with a 17-year-old and you don't have to, like, go down the list of, like, things that they should be aware of. They already have it. And it's about, okay, now let's build.
Exactly. Like, I love this story. Like, I don't know if you guys are familiar. I don't know if this is the McDonald's story that you're referring to. But the whole McDonald's, I'm loving it. Pusha T came up with that. I don't know if you know that.
I heard something about that, but I didn't research it further. I'm like, wait a minute, is this real?
Yeah, no, Pusha T, the rapper, he came up with that. He worked with, I think, Steve Stout. Another great example is the State Farm commercials with Chris Paul, right? Like, that's they conceptualize that. That's an African American agency. And so, like, there are large organizations that are starting to really appreciate, the power of a culturally driven creative agency. The NBA is really pioneering that, and they're really a model that a lot of other institutions should be looking at, because they're saying, okay, we understand that your community is a huge component of our demographic, and we want to be able to build a relationship with you on authentic, in an authentic way. I don't want for us to come through and it seems like we're curry fairing or we're pandering, but we want to have an authentic conversation, an authentic, campaign. And so they're working with African American driven agencies. I think I personally, like I come from the startup world, and I'm starting to see that really start to happen in the startup world. But I think there needs to be more of it. Like in my future vision, in my infinite vision, I see an agency of developers, of technologists that are building products for our communities. So we're not having to deal with the Facebooks of the world and the Twitters of the world where they're literally profiting off of our culture. TikTok is a great example, and the way that you're positioning this as if this is something that is attributed to this culture, to this age group. It's not what's happening in the age group. It is this culture that is constantly creating new and innovative ways to express ourselves, to identify ourselves, to enjoy ourselves. Because let's be real here, we've had an enormously difficult livelihood to maintain. And so joy is a natural part of our culture. And this community, this generation, isn't attributing the value of our culture. They're taking it and they're putting it on like a veil. They're wearing it like a mask. And you are sitting here and you're telling them that this is their culture, and it's not. But that's the challenge, right? Like how do we push that needle so that these individuals that are refusing to attribute our cultural value, our creative value, right? And refusing to allow for us to step into positions where we can actually design the platforms and the features, and design the software and the experiences around our culture. When are we going to be able to design those experiences for ourselves? That's the challenge.
I was doing some research around creating my website for Duke and Joe, and I was looking at, one particular agency that I've been following for years, and I've really enjoyed their work. And I think it was Landor and Associates. And I think along with a lot of other organizations, they've made pledges about equity and diversity and everything. But looking at some of the hierarchy in the agency, it's a very white agency. They're huge, and I just feel like if you're gonna make a pledge, if you're gonna sell to a wide array of people, and we've been talking about it on the call, it needs to better reflect the actual population. So it disappointed me, even though I shouldn't be surprised at an organization like Landor that's all white. But it's like, oh wow, we are really, really not what they're thinking about. And then I just kind of get snapped back to reality. Like, of course, that's the situation. So before we get off the call, because we're almost at an hour and a half now, and I want to respect everybody's time. Is there anybody else that wanted to jump in before we close for the day?
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you, Cliff. That was a really great presentation. I really enjoyed it, and my perspective on it is slightly different. I am more like a self-taught person in design, and to be really honest, until you came up with the subject matter, I hadn't really thought too deeply about it. But when you did the segment on W.E. DuBois, it kind of jogged my memory, because my father is a genealogist, and I look at a lot of vintage and archival sort of images of African Americans throughout history. And I actually came across the visual data set that you had up, and I saw them, and I was kind of shocked by how modern they were. And I kept looking at the time frame, because this happened in 1900 in Paris, France. And I remember thinking to myself, oh my goodness, like, taken out of context, like you could put this right now and it would look so relevant and current. But at the same time, I was also disturbed to think like how some of the data actually wasn't that different from what we see today, which was also kind of shocking and sad at the same time. But I hadn't really thought about the fact that he was actually providing like data visual sets at that point in time, because I didn't really put it all together that way. So I wanted to thank you for highlighting that, because it made me want to go back to the Library of Congress. And if anyone's interested, you can look at all of those data sets at the Library of Congress for free. And W.E.B DuBois was quite prolific in taking portraits of African Americans. So it's really cool if you ever have some time to just go and browse. But I just want to say thank you. And I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you, Natasha, so much. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll quickly chime in. Hey guys, Cam, how's it going?
My boy Cam.
I've been here the whole time. I've just been listening. I'm multitasking, working at the same time. But yeah, this has been a great conversation just overall. And I think the conversations like this actually help with a lot of the issues that you guys were already talking about. But also one of the things that we're all working on, and Cliff has as well, myself, is that aspect of sharing and like also like sharing those stories. Like say, for instance, the Pusha T story, I have heard of it before, but I didn't know like the extent of it. And so I think one of the things that we have to do as more experienced designers and strategists is that we have to start to share a lot more, and whether it's within just our small group on a micro scale, but then also on a macro scale. So whether it's having conversations, having podcasts, those aspects of it, that will help go a long way. Because when a younger designer hears that Pusha T, contributed to a large campaign like that they've seen, they know of, and all that kind of stuff, and then finally hearing that behind your scenes story, that actually helps them just get a little bit more inspired to understand that, okay, design and strategy and all this stuff is for Black people, quote unquote, but now you get to see the contributions. And I think that's the biggest thing that a lot of younger designers don't necessarily see, because when we start designing or we're starting to get into strategy, the references that we usually go to usually are white or non-Black folks. And so once we start to see those little aspects of like, oh, no, we've been here and we've been doing some dope stuff, it's just that we people don't really shine that light. So if they're not going to shine the light, then we're going to have to do it ourselves, even if it's at a smaller level. And so I think that as we start to exchange more information, as we start to have more talks like this, podcasts, and even like on Facebook, Cliff and I are in a couple Black design groups, and that's actually been really therapeutic for myself, because I've been able to share a little bit and contribute stuff that I know of, learn some new things from other people on that. And even on that small micro scale, there's a couple hundred people in there. That's how it starts. So I think these type of conversations is what will help the overall, so that when we start to have those larger conversations with, on the art director, creative director scale, or even on the agency scale, younger designers will have a better basis to start from than I used to design flyers at my church. So I think that's the part that if as our level that we're at now, that's how we can help, because I think that will help go for a long ways and bring up the design community, the Black design community, from where it's kind of like a mix and smattering of different styles and different levels, to things that will grow up a little bit more. So, but yeah, good stuff.
Thank you, Cam. Appreciate that. And yeah, just to bookend what he was saying, we've been talking about this stuff for a while, and it's great to just come together in a setting like this and really hash it out with each other. Thank you, guys. Thank you guys again so much for joining me. This has been educational for myself, as it always is when I get into a long ass conversation with Keone. So it's par for the course. But I hope to do something like this again, maybe underneath another topic where we can all kind of collaborate together in conversation. So I'll see some of you soon for I'll be talking to Hanya sooner than everybody. But yeah, everybody have a good rest of the day, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Peace.